The story of Stephen Avery does not begin with a murder. It begins with a quiet road in rural Wisconsin, with a woman running home in tears, and with a justice system that, from that moment on, would shape every second of Avery's life. In 1985, Stephen Avery was a 23-year-old auto salvage worker from Manitowoc County. He was rough around the edges, had a criminal record for petty offenses, and lived in a family business that already carried a bad reputation. When a local woman was assaulted while jogging near Lake Michigan, Avery became a convenient suspect. He was arrested, charged, and later sentenced to 32 years in prison. Witness identification placed him at the scene. The jury believed the state. The case was closed. But it was wrong. For 18 years, Avery sat in prison insisting he was innocent. While he was locked away, the real attacker committed more violent crimes. It wasn't until DNA testing, decades later, that the truth emerged. Biological evidence excluded Avery and pointed directly to another man. In 2003, Stephen Avery walked free. He was officially exonerated. For most people, that would have been the end of the nightmare. For Avery, it was only the calm before something far worse. After his release, Avery sued Manitowoc County for $36 million, accusing law enforcement of knowingly ignoring evidence that could have proven his innocence years earlier. Depositions were scheduled. Careers, reputations, and entire institutions were suddenly under threat. Avery was no longer just a former inmate. He was a liability. Then, in October 2005, Teresa Halbach disappeared. Teresa was a 25-year-old photographer who worked for Auto Trader magazine. On October 31st, she visited the Avery salvage yard to photograph a vehicle for sale. She never returned home. Days later, her car was found hidden on the Avery property. Burn bones were recovered nearby. Her camera and personal items were discovered in burn barrels. A bullet containing her DNA was later found in Avery's garage. Stephen Avery was arrested again, this time for murder. On the surface, the evidence looked overwhelming. Teresa had been last seen at Avery's property. Her vehicle was concealed there. Physical evidence appeared to link Avery directly to her death. To the jury, it seemed almost unthinkable that an innocent man, recently freed after a wrongful conviction, could again be framed so quickly, so thoroughly. In 2007, Avery was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But as the trial faded from headlines, questions began to surface. Not just small inconsistencies, but structural problems that went to the heart of how the case had been built. Why was Manitowoc County being sued by Avery allowed to assist in the investigation at all? Why were critical pieces of evidence discovered only after multiple searches had already taken place? Why did forensic timelines shift to accommodate new theories instead of the other way around? This is where the case stops being about a single crime and starts being about how justice can bend under pressure. From a psychological perspective, Stephen Avery is not an easy figure to defend. He had a history of violence. He had anger issues. He had clashed repeatedly with authority. These traits made him deeply unlikable, and that matters more than many people want to admit. Jurors are human. Investigators are human. Once someone is seen as the kind of person who could do this, objectivity begins to erode. This phenomenon is known as tunnel vision. Investigators lock onto a suspect early, then interpret every new piece of information in a way that supports that belief. Alternative explanations are dismissed. Contradictory evidence is minimized. In Avery's case, tunnel vision may have been fueled by something even more dangerous: institutional self-preservation. If Avery was framed in 1985, someone failed him. If he was innocent again in 2005, the implications were catastrophic. Entire careers could collapse. Public trust could be destroyed. Lawsuits could bankrupt a county. That pressure doesn't require a conspiracy involving dozens of people. It only requires small decisions made under stress, evidence handled casually, assumptions made quietly, shortcuts justified for the greater good. The bullet found in Avery's garage is one of the most debated examples. It was discovered months after the initial searches. The garage had already been examined multiple times. The bullet carried Teresa Halbach's DNA, but no blood spatter consistent with the prosecution's theory of how she was killed. To supporters of Avery, it looked planted. To the state, it was simply overlooked earlier. Both explanations are unsettling. If the evidence was planted, it suggests corruption. If it wasn't, it suggests incompetence. Either possibility undermines confidence in the verdict. Another critical moment was the interrogation of Avery's nephew, Brendan Dassey. A vulnerable teenager with intellectual limitations, Dassey gave a confession that prosecutors later used to strengthen the narrative against Avery. The confession was filled with inconsistencies and details fed by investigators themselves. Watching the footage, many viewers were left asking the same question: was this a confession or a performance shaped by authority? From an educational standpoint, the Avery case exposes how fragile justice becomes when power dynamics go unchecked. False confessions are not rare. They happen when fear, confusion, and the desire to please authority collide. They happen most often to juveniles, people with cognitive impairments, and those who believe honesty will somehow save them. Stephen Avery's own behavior after his release also deserves scrutiny. Years of wrongful imprisonment can permanently damage a person's psychology. Trust erodes, anger hardens, social development freezes. Even innocence does not guarantee emotional stability. That doesn't make someone a murderer, but it does make them volatile, reactive, and vulnerable to further disaster. So why was Avery convicted? Because the jury was not asked to decide whether the system was flawed. They were asked whether the evidence presented to them proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And when evidence is curated, framed, and delivered by authority figures, it carries enormous weight. The tragedy of the Avery case is not only the death of Teresa Halbach, whose life was brutally cut short and whose family deserves truth and closure. It is also the possibility that justice, once again, may have failed in its most basic duty, to protect the innocent without becoming the enemy of truth. Today, Stephen Avery remains in prison. Appeals continue. Arguments rage on. Some believe he is guilty and always was. Others believe he is the product of a system that learned nothing from its first mistake. The most disturbing question is not whether Avery did it. The most disturbing question is this: if the system was capable of being wrong once, and capable of defending itself at all costs, how would we ever know when it was wrong again? And if we can't know that, then who, exactly, is justice really serving? The case of Brendan Dassey is not a story about a mastermind criminal. It is a story about a child in a room with adults who held all the power, and how words, once spoken, can become chains that never loosen. In 2005, Brendan Dassey was 16 years old. He lived quietly with his family near the Avery salvage yard, attended special education classes, and struggled academically. Teachers described him as shy, eager to please, and easily confused. His IQ tested in the borderline range. Brendan was not street smart. He was not defiant. He was, by almost every account, painfully compliant. When Teresa Halbach disappeared, investigators quickly focused on Stephen Avery. Brendan, Avery's nephew, was initially just background noise, until he wasn't. In February 2006, Brendan was pulled out of school and brought in for questioning. There was no lawyer present, no parent in the room. What followed was hours of interrogation, conducted by trained investigators speaking to a minor who barely understood what was happening. At first, Brendan denied knowing anything. Then the questions changed. Investigators began suggesting details: where the crime happened, how it happened, what Avery supposedly did. Brendan's answers shifted. He guessed. He hesitated. He corrected himself when told he was wrong. Eventually, he said what they wanted to hear. He confessed. On tape, Brendan described helping his uncle rape and murder Teresa Halbach. He spoke about stabbing, shooting, and cleaning up blood. It sounded horrific. It sounded damning. It sounded like the case was finally complete. But when the confession was compared to physical reality, it began to unravel. There was no blood in the bedroom where the assault allegedly occurred. No forensic evidence supporting Brendan's description of the crime. His account changed repeatedly depending on who was questioning him and what prompts they provided. Critical details only emerged after investigators suggested them first. Still, Brendan was arrested and charged. At trial, the confession became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Jurors were told that Brendan had admitted his role voluntarily, that he knew right from wrong, that he had led police to key evidence. But watching the interrogation footage tells a different story. Brendan asks whether he will be able to go back to school. He asks if he did good. At one point, after confessing to murder, he asks investigators if he can go home. These are not the questions of a calculating killer. They are the questions of a child who believes cooperation equals safety. This is where the case moves beyond crime and into psychology, and where it becomes deeply educational. False confessions are one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions in the United States. They do not happen because people want to confess to crimes they didn't commit. They happen because the human brain is wired to escape stress. When authority figures apply pressure, especially to juveniles, the brain seeks relief, not truth. Investigators are trained to break down resistance. They isolate suspects. They minimize consequences. They imply that confession is the fastest way out. For adults, this is already dangerous. For minors with cognitive limitations, it is catastrophic. Brendan Dassey was told that honesty would help him. He was told that lying would make things worse. He was corrected when he gave answers that didn't fit the narrative. Over time, his confession became a collaborative construction. From a legal standpoint, the most troubling question is not whether Brendan said the words, it's whether he understood them. Understanding intent, consequence, and permanence is essential for a confession to be meaningful. Brendan showed none of that comprehension. He echoed language used by investigators. He adopted timelines suggested to him. When asked to describe events independently, he struggled. Yet the system accepted his confession as valid, because confessions are powerful. Jurors are taught to believe that people do not confess to murder unless they are guilty. That assumption, while intuitive, is dangerously wrong. Once Brendan's confession existed, it reinforced the case against Stephen Avery, and once it reinforced that case, it became something the system had a vested interest in defending. Appeals followed. Courts wrestled with whether Brendan's rights had been violated. One federal judge ruled that the confession was coerced and unconstitutional. Another court overturned that decision. Higher courts declined to intervene. At each level, the focus narrowed, not on whether the confession was true, but whether it met technical legal standards. This is another educational fault line. Justice systems often prioritize procedure over reality. If the rules were followed enough, outcomes are allowed to stand even if the outcome feels profoundly wrong. Brendan was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole decades later. Psychologically, the long-term impact is devastating. Juveniles incarcerated for violent crimes experience accelerated emotional damage. Social development halts. Identity becomes frozen in the moment of conviction. For Brendan, prison became his adulthood. There is no evidence that Brendan Dassey committed a violent act before or after the confession. No pattern of aggression. No independent corroboration. Only words extracted under pressure and repeated until they sounded convincing. So why does this matter beyond this case? Because Brendan Dassey represents a category of people the justice system consistently fails: minors, the cognitively impaired, and those who trust authority too much. His case teaches a critical lesson. Truth is not what is spoken loudest or repeated most often. Truth is what survives scrutiny without coercion. If Brendan is innocent, then the system destroyed a life to support a narrative. If he is guilty, then the system still failed by extracting truth in a way that corrupts confidence in the result. Either way, justice loses. Today, Brendan remains incarcerated. He has never wavered from his recantation. He still speaks softly, still defers, still seems unsure of how everything spiraled so far out of his control. And that may be the most disturbing part of all. Because if a confession can be built in a room like that, then how many others exist, unheard, unquestioned, and already forgotten? The name Ed Gein does not echo through history because of the number of victims. It endures because of what investigators found when they stepped inside his home, and what that discovery revealed about isolation, obsession, and a mind that quietly collapsed far from public view. Edward Theodore Gein lived in Plainfield, Wisconsin, a rural farming community where neighbors kept to themselves and privacy was a way of life. After the death of his domineering mother, Augusta, Gein became a ghost in his own town. He rarely spoke. He lived alone in a decaying farmhouse. To most people, he was harmless, odd, perhaps, but polite. That illusion shattered in November 1957. Bernice Worden, a local hardware store owner, vanished during business hours. Blood was found inside the shop. Her son, a deputy sheriff, immediately suspected Ed Gein. When police arrived at Gein's property later that night, they found Bernice's body hanging upside down in a shed, decapitated and gutted like a deer. What came next defied comprehension. Inside Gein's farmhouse, investigators uncovered objects made from human remains. Bowls crafted from skulls, furniture upholstered with skin, masks made from faces, belts of nipples, and clothing stitched from flesh. Body parts were carefully preserved. Others were displayed. The house was not simply a crime scene, it was a shrine to something deeply disturbed. Yet, despite the horror, Ed Gein was not a prolific serial killer. He confessed to 2 murders. Much of what filled his home came from graves he had robbed under the cover of night. He targeted recently buried bodies, selecting women who resembled his mother. This detail matters, because Ed Gein's crimes were not driven by rage or dominance. They were driven by loss, fixation, and identity collapse. Psychologically, Gein's life was shaped almost entirely by his mother. Augusta Gein was intensely religious, controlling, and emotionally abusive. She taught Ed that women were sinful and dangerous except for her. She isolated him from peers. She discouraged relationships. When she died, Ed did not just lose a parent, he lost the framework that defined reality. In that vacuum, fantasy replaced structure. Gein began reading pulp horror magazines, medical textbooks, and stories of grave robbing. He developed a fixation on anatomy and transformation. Investigators later concluded that Gein did not kill for pleasure. He killed or exhumed bodies to construct a physical approximation of his mother, and eventually, of himself as her. This is a crucial distinction for education. Ed Gein was not a sadistic predator in the traditional sense. He was a deeply psychotic individual whose identity fractured under prolonged isolation and untreated mental illness. His crimes were grotesque, but they were also profoundly disorganized, rooted in delusion rather than strategy. When police questioned him, Gein did not attempt to deceive. He spoke calmly, he cooperated, he showed no awareness of the gravity of what he had done. To him, the objects in his home were not trophies. They were tools. This clarity made the legal outcome inevitable. Ed Gein was declared legally insane and committed to a mental institution, where he would spend the rest of his life. He was never released. He was never considered safe. From an investigative standpoint, the case highlights both success and limitation. Police acted quickly once Bernice Worden disappeared. The connection to Gein was immediate. The arrest was clean. The evidence was overwhelming. But the deeper question is this: how did someone like Ed Gein go unnoticed for so long? The answer lies in rural isolation. In small communities, privacy can become invisibility. Gein lived alone. He had no close relationships, no employer, no one entered his home. His odd behavior was dismissed as eccentricity rather than warning. Mental illness, especially in the mid-20th century, was rarely addressed proactively. This is where the educational value of the case becomes uncomfortable. Gein demonstrates what happens when severe mental illness exists without intervention, when isolation is reinforced instead of challenged, when warning signs are normalized because confronting them feels intrusive. The cultural impact of Ed Gein is immense. He became the inspiration for fictional killers like Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. The horror of discovering that something monstrous had been living quietly among ordinary people. But focusing only on the shock misses the lesson. Ed Gein was not born a monster. He was shaped by control, fear, repression, and neglect. His crimes do not excuse him, but they demand that we understand how fragile the human mind can become when cut off from reality and help. In the end, the Gein case is not just about brutality. It is about silence, about what happens when society looks away because something feels uncomfortable, strange, or inconvenient. Because the most disturbing truth is not what Ed Gein created inside his home. It's that no one looked inside until it was far too late. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer is not only about a man who killed. It is about a city that failed to listen, a system that dismissed warning signs, and a pattern of neglect that allowed horror to continue in plain sight. Jeffrey Dahmer grew up in Ohio, not Wisconsin. His childhood was marked by emotional distance, instability at home, and an early fascination with death. As a boy, he collected animal bones. He dissected roadkill. These behaviors were unsettling, but they were not criminal, and so they went largely unaddressed. By the time Dahmer moved to Milwaukee, in the late 1980s, he was already spiraling into alcoholism, isolation, and violent sexual fantasies. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered at least 17 young men and boys. Most were from marginalized communities. Many were black, many were gay, many were poor. This mattered because it shaped how seriously their disappearances were treated. Dahmer's method followed a chilling pattern. He would meet victims at bars, malls, or bus stops. He offered money for photographs. He promised companionship. He moored. Once inside his apartment, he drugged them, strangled them, and then carried out acts of necrophilia and dismemberment. He kept body parts as trophies. He photographed his victims after death. In some cases, he attempted crude lobotomies, injecting chemicals into their skulls in an attempt to create a living but compliant companion. The violence escalated, not because Dahmer became bolder, but because he realized how little resistance he faced. Neighbors complained repeatedly about foul odors coming from his apartment. They heard screams. They contacted police. Each time, the concerns were minimized. Dahmer appeared calm, polite, cooperative, and crucially, he looked like someone officers expected to be harmless. The most infamous failure occurred in May 1991. A 14-year-old boy, drugged and bleeding, escaped Dahmer's apartment and collapsed on the street. 2 women found him and called police. When officers arrived, Dahmer calmly explained that the boy was his adult partner, intoxicated after a lover's quarrel. Despite the victim's visible injuries and confusion, the officers accepted Dahmer's explanation and returned the boy to the apartment. Minutes later, the child was dead. This moment has become one of the most devastating examples of institutional failure in modern American crime history. It was not a lack of evidence. It was not a lack of opportunity. It was a lack of willingness to challenge assumptions. From an investigative perspective, Dahmer was not caught because of advanced forensic work or psychological profiling. He was caught because one victim escaped and refused to return. In July 1991, Tracy Edwards fled Dahmer's apartment with a handcuff dangling from his wrist. Police followed him back to the room. Inside, they found photographs of dismembered bodies, human remains in the refrigerator, acid-filled barrels. There was no ambiguity left. Dahmer was arrested on the spot. When interrogated, Dahmer confessed fully. He did not resist. He did not deny. He explained his crimes in flat, clinical detail. To investigators, he was disturbing not because he was aggressive, but because he was empty. Psychologically, Dahmer presents a profile of extreme detachment. He did not kill out of anger or hatred. He killed to avoid abandonment. His actions were driven by a desire to control, to freeze intimacy so it could never leave him. Sex, power, and loneliness fused into something monstrous. This distinction matters for education. Many people assume serial killers are fueled by rage. Dahmer was fueled by despair. Alcoholism lowered his inhibitions. Fantasy replaced empathy. Over time, the boundary between imagination and action dissolved completely. But Dahmer did not operate in a vacuum. The Milwaukee Police Department failed repeatedly. Complaints were ignored. Missing persons reports were deprioritized. Bias, racial, sexual, and social played a critical role. Victims from marginalized communities did not receive the same urgency or protection. This is the most uncomfortable lesson of the Dahmer case. Systems do not fail equally. Some lives are treated as more urgent than others. Dahmer was convicted and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. He was later murdered by another inmate in prison. For many, that felt like closure, but closure is an illusion, because the real damage was not confined to one man. It was embedded in the assumptions that allowed him to continue. From a prevention standpoint, Dahmer's case teaches several hard truths. Warning signs in childhood matter. Untreated addiction magnifies violent impulses. Community complaints should never be dismissed. And bias spoken or unspoken kills. If police had taken neighbors seriously, lives could have been saved. If officers had trusted victims over appearances, a child might have lived. If systems had valued every disappearance equally, Dahmer's timeline would have been shorter. Instead, the case became a symbol of what happens when authority confuses calmness with innocence and politeness with safety. Today, Dahmer is remembered as one of America's most infamous serial killers, but focusing only on his depravity misses the deeper warning. Because monsters do not always hide in shadows. Sometimes, they live behind doors people knock on again and again while no one listens. The case of Morgan Geyser marks a disturbing shift in modern true crime where the line between online fantasy and real-world violence collapsed in the mind of a child. In May 2014, in the quiet city of Waukesha, Wisconsin, three 12-year-old girls went on what was supposed to be a normal sleepover. They laughed, played games, and talked about school. By the next morning, one of them would be left bleeding in the woods, stabbed 19 times by her two closest friends. The victim survived. That fact alone separates this case from many others, but it does not lessen its psychological weight. Morgan Geyser and her friend believed in Slender Man, a fictional internet character born from online forums and creepypasta culture. To most people, Slender Man was just a story. To Morgan, he was real. More than real, he was powerful, watching, demanding. According to Morgan, Slender Man required a sacrifice. The plan was chilling in its simplicity. The girls lured their friend into a wooded area after the sleepover. There, Morgan stabbed her repeatedly while the other girl encouraged her to continue. Afterward, they left the victim to die and began walking toward what they believed was Slender Man's mansion in the forest. The victim, against all odds, crawled out of the woods and collapsed on a nearby path. A cyclist found her and called for help. Doctors later said she survived only because the stab wounds narrowly missed vital organs. Morgan and her accomplice were arrested within hours. At first glance, the case was labeled as internet influence gone wrong. But that explanation is dangerously incomplete. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Morgan Geyser suffered from early-onset schizophrenia. She experienced hallucinations. She believed imaginary figures could harm her family. Slender Man was not a story to her, it was a framework her illness latched onto. This distinction is critical for understanding the case. Morgan did not stab her friend because the internet told her to. She stabbed her because her untreated mental illness found structure inside a fictional myth. The internet did not create the psychosis, but it gave it a narrative. From an investigative standpoint, the case was straightforward. The confession was immediate. The physical evidence was undeniable. There was no mystery about what happened. The real complexity came afterward. How does a justice system respond when the perpetrator is a child, the motive is delusional, and the outcome nearly fatal? Morgan was charged as an adult, a decision that sparked intense debate. Prosecutors argued that the severity of the crime demanded accountability. Defense attorneys argued that punishment without treatment would be meaningless. This is where the educational weight of the case becomes clear. Mental illness in children often goes unnoticed or misunderstood. Early warning signs, withdrawal, obsessive beliefs, hallucinations, are frequently dismissed as imagination or phases. In Morgan's case, those signs were present long before the attack. The system eventually shifted its approach. Morgan was found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect and committed to a psychiatric institution rather than prison. The goal became treatment, not retribution. But that outcome does not erase the harm. The victim carries physical scars and psychological trauma for life. Morgan will likely spend decades under supervision. Families on all sides were permanently changed. The broader lesson is deeply uncomfortable. When reality becomes indistinguishable from delusion, moral frameworks collapse. Children do not have the cognitive tools to navigate that collapse alone. This case forces a necessary conversation about digital culture, but also about responsibility. Fiction does not cause violence, but when combined with untreated psychosis, it can shape how violence manifests. Education, early intervention, and mental health access are the only real safeguards. Because the most dangerous myths are not the ones we read online. They are the ones that go unquestioned inside a fractured mind. The story of Anissa Weier is often told as a footnote to Morgan Geyser's psychosis. But Anissa's role reveals something different and just as unsettling about how belief, loyalty, and moral drift can lead a child to participate in extreme violence without fully understanding its weight. Anissa Weier was 12 years old when the stabbing occurred. Unlike Morgan, she did not suffer from schizophrenia. She did not experience hallucinations. She did not claim to see Slender Man. What she did have was fear and an overwhelming desire to belong. In interviews, Anissa explained that she believed Slender Man might be real, not with certainty, but with enough doubt to terrify her. She worried that if she didn't help Morgan, Slender Man would kill her family. This fear, combined with her close bond with Morgan, became the foundation for her participation. This distinction matters. Anissa did not lead the attack. She did not hold the knife. But she helped plan it. She encouraged Morgan. And when the victim was stabbed and fell to the ground, Anissa did not stop it. She walked away. From a legal perspective, that made her complicit. From a psychological perspective, it made her a case study in influence. Anissa's actions demonstrate how dangerous shared delusion can be, even when only one person is truly psychotic. When a dominant personality presents a belief with confidence and urgency, others, especially children, may suspend their own doubts to preserve safety or connection. This is known as folie à deux, or shared psychotic disorder. In many cases, the secondary participant does not fully believe the delusion, but behaves as if it might be true, just in case. Anissa later said something chillingly honest. She didn't know if Slender Man was real, but she didn't want to risk being wrong. That sentence explains everything. During interrogation, Anissa appeared calm, articulate, and cooperative. She expressed concern about consequences not for the victim, but for herself. She asked about prison. She asked how long she would be locked up. These questions revealed a child who understood rules and punishment, but not moral gravity. Unlike Morgan, Anissa was found competent to stand trial. She was charged as an adult, a decision that reignited public debate. Should a 12-year-old who didn't physically commit the stabbing face adult consequences? Or was she another child overwhelmed by fear and immaturity? The court ultimately reached a compromise. Anissa pleaded guilty to attempted homicide but was sentenced to a mental health facility rather than adult prison, with the possibility of release after extensive treatment and supervision. This outcome highlights a critical educational divide. Anissa was not mentally ill in the clinical sense. She was cognitively typical. Her danger came from suggestibility, fear, and loyalty, not psychosis. That makes her case more uncomfortable, because it is easier to imagine ourselves or our children in her position. She represents how moral responsibility can erode when authority is replaced by peer influence, and when fear overrides empathy. From an investigative standpoint, the case was clear-cut, confessions aligned, physical evidence matched. The system did not struggle to determine what happened. What it struggled with was how to respond. Punishment alone would not address the root issue. Treatment alone would not acknowledge the harm. The justice system attempted to balance both, but the discomfort remains. Educationally, Anissa's case teaches a lesson that extends far beyond true crime. Children are not equipped to evaluate existential threats. They cannot weigh probability against consequence the way adults can. When fear is introduced, especially fear tied to harm against loved ones, logic collapses. This is why moral education, emotional regulation, and critical thinking are as important as academic achievement. It is also why adults must take children's beliefs seriously, not to validate them, but to guide them safely back to reality. Anissa Weier will likely live a life shaped forever by a decision made at 12 years old. Not because she was evil, but because she was afraid, unsure, and unprepared to challenge a belief she didn't fully understand. The Slender Man case is often framed as a warning about the internet, but Anissa's role reveals a deeper truth. The real danger is not fiction. It is fear without guidance. And when fear goes unanswered, it doesn't just distort reality, it can turn ordinary children into participants in unimaginable harm. The case of Jamie Kloss is not a story about obsession built over years. It is a story about randomness and how a single, impulsive decision can destroy a family in minutes while leaving a child to survive unimaginable terror alone. In October 2018, Jamie Kloss was a quiet 13-year-old living with her parents in the small town of Barron, Wisconsin. There were no warning signs, no known threats, no history of stalking. Her family lived an ordinary life, invisible to the outside world. That invisibility ended abruptly in the early hours of October 15th. Police responded to a 911 call reporting gunshots at the Kloss home. When officers arrived, they found Jamie's parents shot dead inside the house. Jamie was gone. There was no forced entry, no robbery, no message, just a double homicide and a missing child. For weeks, investigators searched desperately. The case drew national attention. Volunteers flooded the area, tips poured in, but there was no suspect, no clear motive, no connection that made sense. Because there wasn't one. The man responsible, Jake Patterson, had never met Jamie. He had seen her step onto a school bus months earlier. That brief glimpse was enough. He later told investigators that he knew she was the one he wanted to take. That decision did not come from emotional attachment. It came from fixation. On the night of the crime, Patterson shot James' parents at point-blank range to eliminate resistance. He dragged Jane from the home, forced her into his car, and drove away. He then took her to a remote cabin, where he kept her hidden for 88 days. Jane was not physically restrained the entire time. Instead, Patterson relied on psychological control. He threatened her repeatedly. He told her she would be killed if she tried to escape. He isolated her completely. He used fear as confinement. This detail is critical. Many people assume captivity requires chains or locks. In reality, fear is often enough. From an investigative standpoint, the case highlights both limitation and success. Early on, law enforcement had almost nothing to work with. No suspect description, no witnesses, no forensic trail leading outward. The randomness of the crime made traditional profiling ineffective. But while investigators struggled, Jamie endured. Psychologically, her survival depended on compliance, patience, and adaptability. She followed instructions. She minimized conflict. She waited. This is a textbook survival response, not weakness, but strategy. In January 2019, James saw her opportunity. While Patterson was away, she escaped the cabin, ran to a nearby home, and begged for help. Neighbors immediately called police. Patterson was arrested hours later. James was alive. The relief was overwhelming, but it was followed by difficult questions. Why did Patterson choose her? Why kill her parents? Why take such extreme steps without any personal connection? The answer lies in fantasy and control. Patterson was not driven by rage or ideology. He was driven by a desire to possess something he believed he could control. Jane was not a person to him. She was an object within a narrative he created in his head. This is an important educational distinction. Crimes like this are not preventable through awareness alone. Jane did nothing wrong. Her parents did nothing wrong. The randomness is what makes the case so unsettling. However, the aftermath offers critical lessons. First, community response matters. The neighbor who helped Jamie did not hesitate. That immediate trust saved a life. Second, survival does not always look dramatic. Jamie survived because she endured, not because she fought back physically. Third, trauma does not end with rescue. Jane lost her parents. She lost her childhood. Recovery is ongoing and invisible. Patterson pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. There was no trial spectacle, no prolonged debate. The evidence was overwhelming. Justice, in this case, was swift. But justice does not restore what was taken. James Claus's case forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Not all evil announces itself. Not all danger is predictable. And not all survival stories come with clean endings. Sometimes, the bravest thing a child can do is stay alive long enough to escape. And sometimes, that is the only victory available. The case of Mark Jensen is one of the most unsettling examples of how fear can travel beyond the grave and how words written in anticipation of death can become the most powerful evidence of all. In December 1998, Julie Jensen was found dead in her home in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. She was 39 years old, a mother of two, and by all outward appearances, living an ordinary suburban life. Her death was initially ruled a suicide by poisoning. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no obvious suspect. But Julie had left something behind. Before her death, she had written a letter. In it, she explained that if anything happened to her, she believed her husband, Mark Jensen, would be responsible. She described escalating marital conflict, fear for her safety, and a growing sense that she was being watched and controlled. She gave the letter to a neighbor and asked that it be opened only if she died. When Julie was found dead days later, the letter was opened. Suddenly, a quiet death became a homicide investigation. Autopsy results revealed ethylene glycol antifreeze in Julie's system. She had been poisoned. The manner of death was no longer ambiguous. And the letter from beyond the grave transformed from a personal fear into a prosecutorial cornerstone. Mark Jensen maintained his innocence. He claimed Julie was depressed and had taken her own life. But investigators uncovered a different picture. Evidence of controlling behavior, financial disputes, and extramarital affairs. The marriage, according to friends and family, had been unraveling behind closed doors. In 2008, Mark Jensen was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide and sentenced to life in prison. Yet the case did not end there. Years later, the conviction was overturned on appeal. The reason was not innocence, it was evidence law. Courts ruled that Julie's letter should not have been admitted as evidence because Jensen could not cross-examine his accuser. The letter, as powerful as it was, violated constitutional protections. This decision sent shockwaves through the legal community. How do you balance a defendant's rights with a victim's voice, especially when that voice predicted the crime? At Jensen's retrial, prosecutors adapted. They introduced new testimony, expert analysis, and circumstantial evidence to reconstruct Julie's final days without relying solely on the letter. The narrative shifted from prophecy to pattern. In 2017, Mark Jensen was convicted again. From an investigative standpoint, this case illustrates both patience and evolution. When a central piece of evidence was removed, the case did not collapse. Investigators re-examined behavior, timelines, and motive. They built a picture of coercive control, slow, quiet, and often invisible. Psychologically, Jensen's alleged motive was not rage, but dominance. Julie was asserting independence. She was considering divorce. For individuals who equate control with security, that loss can feel existential. Poisoning, in this context, becomes a method of avoidance. No confrontation, no visible violence, no immediate suspicion. This is an important educational lesson. Domestic homicide does not always look explosive. It often looks calm, calculated, ordinary. The most dangerous relationships are not always the loudest. They are the ones where fear is normalized and silence is survival. Julie Jensen's letter matters not because it guaranteed guilt, but because it revealed awareness. She recognized patterns, she trusted her instincts, and she documented them. That documentation did not save her life, but it changed the trajectory of justice. The discomfort of this case lies in its question. If victims speak before they die, how should the system listen after they're gone? Mark Jensen remains in prison. The legal debates continue, but the core lesson endures. Sometimes, the truth doesn't shout. Sometimes, it waits written quietly until the world is finally forced to read it. The case of Chandler Halderson is a modern tragedy born not from desperation, but from deception and the terrifying lengths someone will go to protect a lie once it becomes their entire identity. In July 2021, Bart and Krista Halderson were reported missing from their home in Dane County, Wisconsin. Their son, Chandler, told police a simple story. His parents had gone on a weekend trip to their family cabin. They had argued. They needed space. There was nothing unusual about it. At first, investigators had little reason to doubt him. Chandler Halderson was 23 years old, polite, articulate, and well-spoken. He presented himself as a college student nearing graduation, employed at a reputable tech company with a promising future ahead of him. He appeared calm, cooperative, concerned, but his story began to crack almost immediately. Police quickly discovered that Chandler was not enrolled in college. He had been expelled. The job he claimed to have did not exist. The successful life he described to his parents was entirely fabricated. For years, Chandler had been living inside a carefully constructed fantasy, and his parents were starting to realize it. Investigators believed that confrontation was imminent. And when lies collapse, panic follows. Soon after, human remains were found scattered across multiple locations in rural Wisconsin. DNA confirmed the unthinkable. Bart and Krista Halderson were dead. Their bodies had been dismembered and disposed of in separate sites. Chandler was arrested. From an evidentiary standpoint, the case against him was overwhelming. Surveillance footage placed him near disposal locations. Digital records contradicted his timeline. Physical evidence tied him directly to the crime. Unlike many cases, this one did not hinge on a single piece of disputed proof. It was built on accumulation. But understanding how this happened requires moving beyond evidence and into psychology. Chandler did not kill for money. He did not kill in self-defense. He killed because the lie had become unsustainable. Psychologically, this case reflects what happens when identity is built entirely on performance. Chandler's sense of worth was tied to appearing successful. Admitting failure would have meant admitting collapse not just to his parents, but to himself. For individuals with narcissistic traits, exposure is not embarrassment, it is annihilation. Instead of facing accountability, Chandler chose elimination. The brutality of the crime, dismemberment, concealment, deception, suggests not emotional loss of control, but calculated preservation of image. Each act after the murder served one purpose: to maintain the illusion a little longer. This distinction is critical for education. Parricide cases often involve abuse, mental illness, or long-term trauma. The Halderson case involved none of those. Bart and Krista were described as supportive parents. Their mistake was trust. This challenges a dangerous myth that love and support always protect against violence. They don't when the threat comes from shame and entitlement rather than anger. From an investigative perspective, the case demonstrates the power of digital footprints. Lies that once survived socially collapse under data. Location records, phone activity, surveillance all contradicted Chandler's narrative within days. Unlike older cases, there was no mystery that lingered. Technology compressed time. Deception failed fast. Chandler was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The educational lesson of this case is uncomfortable but necessary. We live in a culture that rewards appearance over honesty. Success is curated. Failure is hidden. For most people, that pressure results in anxiety or burnout. For a few, it results in something far darker. The Halderson case warns us about the danger of identity built entirely on performance, without resilience, without honesty, without a way to fail safely. Because when someone believes that the truth will destroy them, they may decide to destroy everything else first. The disappearance of Luke Berg is not defined by what investigators found. It is defined by what they never did. In October 2009, Luke Berg was 13 years old. He lived in the rural town of Everett, Wisconsin, a place surrounded by dense woods, winding trails, and quiet isolation. On October 16th, Luke left home to attend a football game at his school. He never returned. At first, his absence did not immediately trigger alarm. In small towns, children are given freedom. Time passes more slowly. But as hours turned into night, concern grew. By morning, Luke was officially missing. Search efforts began quickly. Volunteers, law enforcement, and search and rescue teams combed the surrounding woods. Dogs tracked Luke's scent to a nearby forested area. Then it vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, no belongings recovered, no confirmed sightings after he left for the game. And just like that, Luke Berg disappeared. As days passed, hope gave way to confusion. The area had been searched extensively. Weather conditions were not extreme. Luke had no known reason to run away. His family described him as responsible, shy, and deeply connected to home. Nothing fit. Investigators considered multiple possibilities: an accident in the woods, abduction, voluntary disappearance. None could be confirmed. With no evidence pointing decisively in any direction, the case began to stall. This is the quiet danger of cold cases. They do not explode into failure, they fade. Psychologically, the impact on families is uniquely cruel. There is no body to mourn, no certainty to accept. Every unanswered question becomes permanent. Parents remain suspended between hope and grief, unable to move fully into either. From an investigative standpoint, Luke's case highlights a painful truth. When evidence disappears early, time becomes the enemy. Memories degrade. Witnesses move on. Landscapes change. Leads dry up. But there is another, deeper lesson here. Rural disappearances are often underestimated. Sparse populations mean fewer witnesses. Vast terrain complicates searches. And when nothing obvious points to a crime, urgency slowly erodes. That erosion matters. Because if Luke's disappearance involved foul play, then the most critical window for discovery closed without resolution. And if it was an accident, the absence of answers still leaves a family without peace. Years later, investigators acknowledged mistakes. Search areas may not have been fully secured. Early assumptions may have limited exploration of alternative theories. But hindsight does not return the missing. Today, Luke Berg's case remains open. There are no arrests, no definitive explanations. Only a name, a photograph, and a question that refuses to fade. Cold cases like this serve a final educational purpose. They remind us that justice is not only about solving crimes, it is about refusing to forget them. Attention is a form of protection. Silence is a risk. Luke Berg did not leave behind evidence, a confession, or a trail to follow. What he left behind was absence. And sometimes, absence is the most haunting outcome of all. What ties these cases together is not just geography. It is not just the borders of Wisconsin. It is the quiet way systems fail, minds fracture, and ordinary lives slip into places no one expects. Some of these stories ended with convictions. Some ended with institutions instead of prisons. Some never ended at all, but none of them were simple. And that may be the most unsettling truth. Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey force us to confront how fragile justice becomes when pressure outweighs patience. When truth is shaped to fit a narrative instead of discovered through restraint, they remind us that a system built by humans will always carry human flaws, and those flaws don't disappear just because a verdict is delivered. Gein and Jeffrey Dahmer show us the cost of neglect, of isolation mistaken for harmlessness, of warning signs dismissed because they were uncomfortable, inconvenient, or didn't fit expectations. Their crimes were not sudden explosions of evil. They were slow descents that no one stopped. The Slender Man case reveals something newer, and perhaps more disturbing. That belief does not need to be rational to be dangerous. That fear, when left unguided, can override empathy even in children. And that responsibility does not vanish simply because someone is young. James Closs reminds us that not all violence follows patterns we can predict. Sometimes there is no motive we can understand, no behavior we can anticipate. Survival, in those moments, becomes its own form of courage, quiet, patient, and unseen. Mark Jensen and Chandler Halderson show how control and deception can thrive behind closed doors. How appearances can mask desperation. How the desire to maintain an image can become more powerful than love, honesty, or life itself. And then there is Luke Berg. No trial, no confession, no answers, just absence. Cold cases do something no solved case ever can. They refuse to let us feel finished. They linger. They remind us that justice is not only about what we prove but about who we remember. Taken together, these cases tell a single, uncomfortable story. That danger does not always look dangerous. That truth does not always arrive cleanly. And that justice, when rushed or ignored, can become another form of harm. True crime is often consumed as entertainment, but its real value lies elsewhere. In education, in awareness, in the willingness to look directly at failure, not to sensationalize it, but to understand it. Because understanding is the only thing that makes prevention possible. And if these stories teach us anything at all, it is this: silence helps no one, assumptions save no one, and forgetting is the most permanent injustice of all. Somewhere between certainty and doubt, between guilt and innocence, between fear and responsibility, that is where these stories live. And that is where we are left to decide what kind of system and what kind of society we are willing to accept.